All right, guys. Welcome to American History, Chapter 14 through 16 study guide review here. Hopefully, you guys have been working on your own, preparing yourself for the test. And I'm just going to come in here and try to help you out just a little bit more. Okay. These chapters are pretty simple chapters, but really what we're talking about here is the movement of America towards industrialization, kind of the effects of the Industrial Revolution in America, the effects on workers. We're going to talk about relationships between the races. That will have a big part to do with this. So let's jump into it. So Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a very important event in American history. Where you have these girls who have been locked into their place of employment. They're 11 stories up. They're in the textile industry basically. Their bosses didn't want them sneaking out to smoke cigarettes, take cigarette breaks and things, so they locked them in. And one day, disaster happened, and a fire caught up, and they had nowhere to go. And so, 146 of them died by either fire, suffocation, or jumping out of the windows. And it was very shocking to America. And it was one of those things that was going to help lead us to more workers' rights because it really was seeing the bodies and the people who actually saw the bodies, jumping out of the building at the time were definitely affected by this. So it helped labor relations in America. Now, also in this time period, we have immense urbanization. We got all these people coming to the big cities, especially New York and Boston, Philadelphia, places like that. And we have a need for to move up instead of out. And so we build skyscrapers. And skyscrapers, it's impossible without the Bessemer process, without new ways of making a strong, sturdy steel. It would have been impossible to build some of these skyscrapers that, the first started 10 stories up, but eventually you're talking, 60, 70 stories for some of these early skyscrapers. So without new steel, that would have been impossible to make. And skyscrapers, hugely important in early American history. When we talk about the industrial boom of the early 1900s, there's quite a few things that actually go into that to help make that possible. America had huge natural resources. We had all the coal, we had iron ore, we need all the things that we needed to be an industrial powerhouse. We had those. We have a much larger urban population. We have many immigrants coming to America, and they're flocking to the cities where the jobs are. And because they're flocking to cities, it opens up more jobs because there's labor out there who wants a job. You also had immense government support for these businesses. Government typically was on the side of business. We are subsidizing, that meaning that we're taking money from taxes and propping up some of these businesses. So all these things are going to lead to this huge industrial boom there in the early 1900s. Railroads, of course, are a huge part of this time period. We talked about their importance and how powerful they were. So powerful that they're even going to lead to the time zones. We live in Central Standard Time Zone, but you have Pacific and Mountain Time and all that, and Eastern Time Zone. That's because the railroads were looking for a way to keep a train schedule easier. And even though there was resistance from the Senate and other places about making the time zones, the railroad said, well, if you want to catch the train on time, you'll go by our time. And so it was the railroads that really invented the 24 time zones here in America. So keep that in mind. All right. What else we got? Let's see. Social Darwinism. Remember that this is, basically the idea that the rich people deserve to be rich and the poor people deserve to be poor because they're either lazy or stupid. It's going to justify the power of millionaires, successful big businesses. Why would we attack them? They're there for a reason. Poverty exists for a reason because those people, again, are lazy or just not smart. So social Darwinism. When we also talk a little bit about the immigration stations that existed in America. We had two. In the East, it was Ellis Island. there in New York, and mostly European immigrants coming into that station. And it was a little bit easier way into America as far as the conditions and how you were treated there. On the other side of the world, or of America, was San Francisco, and that was Angel Island there in San Francisco. Mostly Asians coming in this route, and they weren't treated nearly as good as those people there in Ellis Island. Um, let's see, Chinese Exclusion Act. Speaking of Asians, you do have a large number of Chinese and Japanese coming to America. People are beginning to push back against this. This nativism that emerges in America. And so, what was the goal of the Chinese Exclusion Act? What were they trying to do? Very simple. They're just simply trying to decrease Chinese immigration. Too much competition for low-paying jobs. They don't like the fact that they're not speaking English, and so they just want to decrease Chinese immigration. They want to keep the Chinese from coming over here at all. All of this nativist movement and stuff, we're all talking about Americanization. And Americanization is the assimilating of foreign peoples into American society. That's the idea behind it. We want them to be more like us. And if we can get them more like us, we can tolerate them a little bit better. We talked about political machines and the great power that they wielded in this time period, basically trading services for votes, of course. And unfortunately, a lot of them became corrupt with their power and with their money. And you got instances of graft, where you're basically using political influence for personal gain. You had kickbacks. We talked about that in class, where I award you a bid on a job and you kick back some money to me so that it makes more sense for me to give you the job because I'm going to get some money from you. The worst of the political machines, of course, was Tammany Hall, of which Boss Tweed was the head of Tammany Hall there in New York. And, he eventually get ran out of there and arrested, but not before he has milked the people of New York City for millions of dollars. I remember the courthouse where a $3 million courthouse actually cost the people of New York $13 million, and he put the rest of that in his and his friend's pocket. Along with these political machines, you had issues of patronage and these government officials. You had patronage, and really all that was hooking up the people that supported you. If you win an election, you are appointing somebody to a job that maybe they're not qualified for, and we know that there's some issues with that. If you assign somebody a Department of Education head, you should hope that they have an education, that they're qualified to actually do that job. And sometimes they weren't in this time period, and so patronage is going to become something that reformers want to attack. So keep that in mind. Oh, give me just a second. My computer messed up on me. Let's see here. Okay, Gentleman's Agreement. Of course, the Gentleman's Agreement had to do with Teddy Roosevelt and the country of Japan. What was going on was out there in San Francisco, we were segregating Japanese students, meaning we weren't letting them go to school with the white kids. And the Japanese took exception to that, as you can imagine. And they have a conversation. And Teddy says, if you will stop sending us unskilled workers, then I will end the segregation going on in the schools. And so you get this gentleman's agreement. And so segregation is busted up, and the Japanese limit the number of people migrating to the United States. So it worked out on both sides. We also get a president in this reform-minded time period named James Garfield. And Garfield is actually going to be assassinated. And that's because he's a man who supports civil service reform. He wants to get rid of patronage. He wants to get rid of graft and corruption in politics. And the guy who shoots him is a guy who lost his job because of this. And so he takes it out on Garfield and will end up shooting him and killing him. We get, race relations in this time period, of course. We get the famous court case Plessy versus Ferguson that, basically says separate but equal, that school segregation is okay as long as the facilities are equal in their service. That's late 1890s. That's going to get overturned later on, but that's Plessy versus Ferguson. Bicycle craze. We talked a little bit about it. Remember that it was this huge deal, especially for the ladies, who it gave them a large sense of independence. They're wearing more comfortable clothing. They're out without chaperones. Does a lot to advance the women's movement. We also talked about the difference between Booker T. Washington, our two guys pictured right here, Booker T. Washington on the right and W.E.B. Du Bois on the left. And essentially that while both believe in education to some degree or another, Washington believes that blacks should, start out and work in lower fields and prove their economic value to the whites, because he feels like that's the only way that they'll ever be accepted. Whereas Du Bois is a little more demanding in his. He knows that some African Americans are very talented and should reap the rewards of that talent. And so the two men, two sides of the same coin, right? Let's see. They put limitations on African Americans, of course, in this time period. They're trying to keep them from voting. Things like poll taxes. A lot of African Americans couldn't afford to pay the poll tax to be able to vote. They had literacy tests, another way of limiting them and their right to vote. And of course, they finished off with like the grandfather clause, which basically said that only people whose grandfathers voted are eligible to vote for and vote in the election. So these are all major issues. So essentially, African Americans don't really have the right to vote. Turn of the century stuff we kind of just talked about, but so bicycling and amusement parks and sports and things that we've talked about, people are more interested in leisure time now. It's a kind of a work hard, play hard mentality. The idea is that I work my tail end off, so I deserve to have some fun, to have some leisurely activities, and so you'll see a massive rise of those at the turn of the century. Let's see here. Professional baseball, vaudeville, amusement parks, boxing, all those things were popular. Meanwhile, in the South, we had things like Jim Crow laws, which basically regulate what can go on between the races. It kept them separated, separate water fountains, separate movie theaters, stuff like that. So Jim Crow laws should be easy to remember. Okay, really that is the essential aspects of this test that covers 21 of the 25 questions. Questions 22 through 25 will be a document that you will answer a question in regards to. So you want to have some outside knowledge, and those cover race relations and the power of the monopolies, the robber barons or captains of industry, however you view them. So hopefully this review helps you guys out, and you're studying and you're going to come in and destroy this test. Thank you.